Welcome, Rafters. This video provides an introduction to the Raft Trip Planner, which is a free Google Sheet which assists in managing trip information, rafter contact information, expenses for the group, deposits if the group is using them for this trip, reimbursements, and you can plan your meals and your logistics, gear, boats, transport for your rafting and camping trip. This introduction video will demonstrate the use of the planner using a typical scenario, a 4-day raft trip with 12 rafters without the use of deposits. This demonstration uses examples made from a copy of the raft trip template. The copy was created by clicking the template link in the video description section below. So starting in the Setup tab, your trip planner will be initialized by your chosen trip leader and CFO. In step 1, a trip title and description are provided. In step 2, the itinerary is set up by selecting a start date, how many river days that the trip will have, and how many days it takes to travel to the river to begin with. So in this particular example, you can see that we have automatically generated. In fact, let's just demonstrate that. Let's say we started with 1 river day, then you would travel for a day, and then you would put in and finish the trip on the same day. In our case, we want to have 4, so we generate an itinerary that starts on May 4th and ends on May 8th with the takeout. We then select our roles for the trip. For shorter trips like this, typically you have a trip leader and a CFO who can be the same person. Before you actually select these two, you actually have to define your rafters or to record them, their contact information. So here on the Rafters tab, you'll find that the rafters have been recorded. So you have to at least record your trip leaders in order to set them up. And here you can see that they have been set up and they're indicated as to who you've picked. In step 4, the group expense policy is defined by the CFO, who first selects expense categories for the group from a drop-down list. The most typical ones have been selected for this example, most used ones, and they can be designated either as being used by all rafters, which all of these are, which typically they would be, and you can exclude 1 or more categories, usually so you want to display very clearly to somebody that they're not, the group is not paying for certain expenses. The CFO then spells out the group expense policy, writes it out, and this is displayed on the expense tab, which we'll look at a little later. Once they've set the group expense policy, they then open up the expense status and they turn off deposits. In our example, we're turning off deposits. Most trips don't use deposits, so that's usually a no. And at that point, then they share the permissions for each rafter to utilize the sheet and make sure that they can edit it, and that completes the initial setup. We move to the Rafters Home tab, and we'll find our trip leaders, our group notifications, our itinerary, the expense status, and other trip information. Now we can also use this spreadsheet to do meal and logistics planning. So if we look, we can define food groups, people who are responsible together to handle certain meals, and those meals are assigned on the Meals tab to the different groups, and then the groups there can plan their meals and coordinate their meals. Information from the Rafters tab can be used to make sure you take care of dietary restrictions, so they can be defined on the Rafters tab. Here we see Jane has a shellfish allergy, and so it shows up here in the dietary restrictions, and you'll see it on the Meals tab so the planners can take advantage of it. Here you'll see the meal schedule, which is automatically generated also from the itinerary. You can also plan your gear and supplies. So we have a fairly comprehensive list of typical supplies and gear, and so that you can just simply uncheck the things you're not going to use, and then you can define who's responsible, how much you need, and other notes to make sure you've got the gear you need. You can add and modify this any way you want to. You can then describe your boats and make sure you have enough capacity and your transport and shuttle information. And then we go on to expense management. So in expense management, we can record group expenses, and then we can manage reimbursements to rafters who have spent more than the average expense from rafters who spent less. So this is a typical example of where we're not using deposits. Most trips don't, shorter trips. So here we see an example of various rafters who've recorded expenses here. And so let's record a few for Jane. So Jane is going to spend some money in her food group. And so $120. And let's say she spent some more later on the food group, another $50, let's say. And then let's say she spent some money on, say, some propane, maybe. Here, another $50. Okay. And so you'll notice here that all the expenses for the trip are summarized over here. So Jane, we see, has a total of $170 for her food group, the $120 and the $50. We see that she has $50 of other for that propane. So her total is $220, and her total outlay is $220. This would be more if she'd actually put in some deposits too. We're not using them, obviously. And so, and then we calculate an overall average expense per rafter. So the total expenses here are $3,000. We have 12 rafters. So every tab has a rafter count. So that because that's pretty useful here. And so we get our average of $250, and we see that Jane had an outlay of $220 she spent. She owes $250 to the group, so she owes an overall net of $30 to the group. So once all the expenses are finished, the trip is over. We ordinarily take a couple days after the trip before we go, because these days we can pay each other through Venmo and etc. So we can get last minute expenses in. And so at that point, once the trip is over, the CFO will close expenses, and they will manage reimbursements. So all the information we saw in the expense tab, we see the necessary information here. These are the people who owe money. These are the people who are owed money, and we see the amount that is owed. And so the CFO will come in here, and for example, they can do this manually. Jane owes $30. She's going to pay $30 to Bill. So when I put $30 in here in the bill column, then you see that she no longer owes any money, and he is owed $30 less because he's just been paid $30. So you can do this manually, the CFO can, and sometimes they'll do part of it. And whatever's left over, they can do automatically. Press a button. The first time that CFO runs the button, he has to authorize the spreadsheet so that he can run the script. That's just a one-time thing for just the CFO. And now we see that this automatically was reimbursed. Everybody's reimbursement, so nobody owes any money left and nobody is owed any more money. Our total here shows 0, and we see a status that says that the reimbursement has been completed and that the email is ready. So we can jump to the email tab, and we will see here, an email is generated that's mailed out to all of the rafters, and it describes how much was spent, what the payout instructions are, who owes who money, and the information necessary for them to contact each other. So the idea is that every rafter is responsible for working with each other to pay each other back for those who owe money to the other people in the group. So this is a pretty comprehensive email. It's automatically generated, and it manages what is otherwise, with 24 rafters and a 3-week trip, a very complicated process. So that's really the end of the trip, and that is the final step in utilizing this to manage your raft trip. So there's additional information and multiple links in the video's description below. There's a link that allows you to make your own copy of the Raft Trip Planner template so that you can build a planning spreadsheet for your own raft trip. The example that we just used was built by making a copy and then filling it out with sample information. So the example that we use, there's also a link so that you can look at that specific example, make your own copy, and you can try that out with sample data. So comments are most welcome, especially if you have questions or issues with the planning spreadsheet. And don't forget to like this video if you found it useful. Happy rafting.